I never thought I'd be the kind of man who calls his neighbor to ask if anyone's been walking around inside his house. I'm not the paranoid type. Never have been. But after what happened last spring, I check my phone every single morning before I even get out of bed. Not emails, not news. The camera feeds. My name is Roy Callahan. I'm 52 years old, and I work as a pipeline inspector for an energy contractor out of Midland, Texas. The job takes me out to the Permian Basin for stretches at a time, usually 2 to 3 weeks out, then a week back home. It's not glamorous work, but it pays well, and after my divorce 6 years ago, I didn't need much space anyway. I bought a small ranch-style house in a quiet subdivision just outside of Odessa. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, a garage I never quite finished organizing. It was mine. That was the only thing that mattered. I'd been doing this rotation for almost 4 years without incident. Leave on a Monday, come back on a Friday, repeat. My neighbor across the street, an older retired man named Walt, would wave at me when I pulled in the driveway. That was about the extent of my social life in that neighborhood. I liked it that way. The call came on a Tuesday in March. I was about 80 miles northeast of Pecos, doing a routine inspection on a section of line, when my phone buzzed. It was a number I recognized. Carl Webb, the guy who managed our subdivision's HOA. We'd spoken maybe twice in 3 years, both times about dues. So when I saw his name on the screen, I figured it was something administrative. Maybe a fine for my trash cans being visible from the street or something equally pointless. It wasn't. "Roy," he said. And his voice had that careful quality that tells you someone is choosing their words. "I don't want to alarm you, but I've been getting some unusual reports." I stepped away from the section of pipe I was logging and pressed the phone tighter to my ear. "What kind of reports?" He told me that 2 different residents on my street had mentioned seeing lights on in my house at unusual hours. One of them, a woman who walked her dog every evening around 9, had seen someone moving around inside on multiple nights over the past month. She'd assumed it was me. Then she'd run into Walt, who'd mentioned I wasn't due back for another 2 weeks. That's when she'd called Carl. I told him the same thing anyone would tell him. There's no one in that house. I live alone. I haven't given a key to anyone. There was a pause that felt longer than it probably was. "Roy, I think you should come home." I drove back to Odessa that same night. Didn't tell my site supervisor the full story. Just said there was a family emergency, which wasn't entirely a lie. I made it back in under 4 hours, which is about as fast as that drive can be made without getting pulled over. I didn't go straight to my house. Something stopped me. Maybe it was the fact that Carl had said this had been going on for a month. A month. Whoever this was, they weren't panicking. They had a routine. If I walked in the front door right now, I had no idea what I was walking into, and I had no leverage, no proof of anything, just my word that someone was in there without permission, and if that person had a key and claimed otherwise, I'd be standing in my own living room with nothing. So I parked 2 blocks over, killed the headlights, and sat. From where I'd stopped, I had a partial view of my front window. At 11:20 at night, I watched a light come on in the room I used as a home office. Then the kitchen. Someone was in there moving around like they belonged. I sat in my truck for almost 20 minutes. My hands were on the steering wheel the whole time, and I never once started the engine. I drove to a Motel 6 off the highway and spent the night staring at the water-stained ceiling, running through every scenario I could think of. By 6 a.m., I had a plan. First thing I did was call the non-emergency line for the Ector County Sheriff's Office. The deputy I spoke with was polite and genuinely sympathetic, but he gave me the same reality check I wasn't ready to hear. Without evidence of forced entry, without being able to prove the person inside hadn't been given some form of permission, it would be difficult to act immediately. What he told me next is the part that stuck if I could document what was happening. Video, timestamps, anything showing unauthorized access. The case became significantly stronger. He wasn't brushing me off. He was telling me how to actually win. I went to Walmart and bought 2 indoor wireless cameras, a doorbell camera with a wide-angle lens, and a prepaid tablet. Back at the motel, I set up accounts and tested the apps. Then, in the early afternoon, when I felt reasonably certain whoever was staying in my house had gone out, I drove over and parked around the corner. Walking to my own back door felt surreal. I moved quietly out of habit, even though I had every legal right to be there. The moment I stepped inside, I knew. It wasn't dramatic. It was just wrong. The kind of wrong that settles in your chest before your brain has fully caught up. There were dishes in my drying rack that I'd never owned. A bottle of hot sauce on the counter I'd never bought. The living room couch had a throw blanket draped over the back, not mine. And on the coffee table there was a half-finished crossword puzzle from a newspaper dated 10 days ago. 10 days. Someone had been sitting on my couch doing crossword puzzles for at least 10 days. I walked through the house slowly. The guest bathroom had a separate razor and a bottle of men's cologne I didn't recognize. In the second bedroom, the one I used for storage, someone had cleared a path through the boxes and set up an air mattress with actual sheets on it. There was a phone charger plugged into the wall. A pair of running shoes by the door. My bedroom, at least, looked undisturbed. But the kitchen refrigerator had food in it that wasn't mine. Not just the hot sauce. There were groceries. Someone had gone shopping. I felt something shift in me standing in that kitchen. Not anger, not yet. Something colder. The understanding that this person had made decisions about my home. Had walked through it, evaluated it, decided what to keep and what to move. Had treated it like a resource. I installed the cameras carefully, tucking one behind the bookshelf in the living room, one above the cabinets in the kitchen, and the doorbell unit outside. I reset everything I'd disturbed and left the way I came in. By 4:40 that afternoon, I was back at the motel with the tablet propped on the pillow when the doorbell camera sent me my first notification. I opened the feed and watched a man, mid-40s, stocky build, wearing a grey pullover and jeans, carrying a plastic bag from what looked like a grocery store, walk up to my front door like he'd done it 100 times. He had a key. He used it without hesitation. Over the next few days, I watched his routine. He left around 8 in the morning, came back in the late afternoon. He cooked. He watched television. He did laundry in my washer. I documented everything, timestamp screenshots, screen recordings, the whole thing saved to a cloud account I created specifically for this. On the 4th day, he had a visitor. It was a woman, probably late 30s, dark hair, carrying a tote bag and a laptop. She didn't have a key. She knocked, and he let her in. Through the living room camera, I watched them sit down at my dining table and open the laptop together. They were looking at something on the screen, pointing at it, talking in a way that looked transactional rather than social. After about an hour and a half, she left. He went back to watching TV. That night, I did something I should have done immediately. I looked up my address on Verbo. It was listed under a slightly altered description. Quiet West Texas retreat minutes from Odessa amenities, ideal for contract workers and extended stays. The photos were of my house, my furniture, my backyard. The nightly rate was $185, with a 2-night minimum. There were 11 reviews. The oldest was from 4 months ago. I read every single one. Comfortable stay, great communication with the host, felt very private and secure. Host was flexible with checkout. The host. They were calling him the host of my property. My hands were steady when I put the phone down, which surprised me. I think I'd already known, somewhere in the back of my mind, what this was. Seeing it confirmed didn't make me feel worse. It made me feel focused. I started searching for information on the man. I didn't have his name yet, but I had his face from the camera footage. On the 5th day, I got lucky. He'd left a piece of mail on my counter, something he'd apparently received at my address, forwarded through the listing. I was able to zoom in on the camera footage and make out enough of it to work with. The name on the envelope was Kevin Marsh. Kevin Marsh had a LinkedIn profile that described him as an independent short-term rental consultant. He had a website, reviews from property investors. He called himself a hospitality optimization specialist, which I now understood meant he found empty houses and rented them out to people who didn't know they were paying a criminal. But there was still a piece I couldn't account for. How did Kevin know my schedule? How did he have access to a key? I went back through the camera footage from the first week, watching every person who came and went. Kevin had one other visitor besides the woman, a younger man, maybe late 20s, who stopped by on a Wednesday morning and stayed about 30 minutes. He was wearing a polo shirt with a logo on the chest. I screenshotted it and zoomed in as far as the resolution would allow. The logo was for a company called Lone Star Property Care. It took me about 10 seconds to remember why that name was familiar. They were the company I'd hired to do a bi-weekly check-in on my property while I was on rotation. They had a key. They had my contact information, and because I always gave them my work schedule so they'd know when to expect me back, they had my calendar. I called their main number and asked to speak with whoever handled my account. The woman who answered was friendly, cheerful, completely unprepared for the question I was about to ask. "I want to know the name of the employee assigned to check on my property at this address," I said. I gave her my address and waited. She gave me a name. Corey Dillard. 26 years old according to the public records I pulled up within the hour. He'd been with the company for 18 months. I called my contact at the company, the owner, a man I'd met once when I signed the service agreement, and told him I needed to talk. I didn't give details over the phone. He agreed to meet the next morning, and to his credit, he showed up. I told him what I'd found. I showed him the screenshots. I showed him the Bravo listing. When I showed him the footage of Corey at my house, sitting across from a man who was operating an illegal rental out of my property, he went very quiet for a long moment. "I had no idea," he said. I believed him. But I also knew that didn't change what had happened. "I need to know if any other properties in your client list have been affected," I said. He told me he'd look into it immediately. I told him not to tip off Corey. He promised he wouldn't. That same day, I called the sheriff's office again and asked to speak with someone in the investigations unit. The detective who took my call was a man named, and I'll leave his name out of this, but he was good at his job. Methodical. Unhurried. He looked through everything I put together over the past week and a half and said, quietly, that this was more than a property dispute. "This is fraud," he said. "And if there are other properties, it's organized fraud." Over the next 3 weeks, law enforcement built the case. Corey Dillard folded quickly when interviewed. He'd been approached by Kevin 8 months earlier with a simple pitch: identify clients with frequent travel schedules, provide temporary access, collect a flat fee per booking. He'd passed along information and key access for at least 6 different properties. Kevin handled the listings. The woman, whose name turned out to be Diane Pryor, handled the marketing side. Photos, descriptions, guest communications. She'd designed the whole digital presence of what Kevin called his portfolio. The operation had grossed just over $91,000 across the 6 properties before it was shut down. I wasn't there for the arrest. The detective called me that evening and told me it was done. Kevin had been at my property when officers arrived, in the middle of a guest check-in. A retired couple from New Mexico who'd driven up for a few days and had no idea they'd paid $370 to sleep in a stranger's house without permission. They were devastated when they found out. The detective told me they kept apologizing even as they were being escorted out, which seemed deeply unfair to me. They were victims too. Kevin Marsh was charged with burglary, fraud over a specified amount, theft of services, and conspiracy. Diane Pryor was charged with fraud and conspiracy. Corey Dillard was charged with breach of fiduciary duty and conspiracy. He cooperated fully and received a reduced sentence, 2 years probation and restitution. Kevin got 18 months in state jail and 5 years probation. Diane got 14 months. Both were ordered to pay restitution to all 6 property owners. My portion came to just over $16,000, which covered the utility overages, the cost of having the entire house professionally cleaned, new locks on every door and window, and a permanent security system installation. It didn't cover the part where I had to sleep in my own bed knowing a stranger had been eating breakfast at my kitchen table for 4 months. That part doesn't have a dollar amount. I still own the house. I thought about selling it. For a few months after everything was resolved, I'd walk through the rooms and feel the ghost of it. The wrong placement of a couch cushion. The outline of where an air mattress had pressed against the carpet. But I decided I wasn't going to let someone else's criminal stupidity take my home from me, so I stayed. What I couldn't get past, and still haven't entirely, is the trust piece. I hired Lone Star Property Care precisely because I was away so often. The entire point was to have someone responsible keeping an eye on things. And inside that system, one person saw my absence as an inventory item, saw my schedule as a product, sold access to my private life for a flat fee per booking. The owner of Lone Star shut the company down 4 months after the arrests. I don't know if that was guilt or just the practical reality that no one was going to hire a property care company whose employee had been indicted for conspiracy. All 6 of us filed a civil suit against the company. We settled out of court. I'm not allowed to discuss the amount. The other 5 homeowners I eventually connected with through the investigation were all similar profiles. People who traveled for work, who trusted the system, who'd assumed a locked door was enough. One of them, a woman who worked in oil and gas like me, told me she'd found a Yelp review of her own home praising the cozy atmosphere and well-equipped kitchen. Her atmosphere. Reviewed by a stranger who'd paid someone else for the privilege of being there. Another one, a man who worked long stints on offshore platforms in the Gulf, told me that when he'd gone through his home after the arrests, he'd discovered that someone had gone through the filing cabinet in his home office, his personal documents, tax returns, insurance policies, the deed to the property. His identity hadn't been stolen yet, but the detective told him it had almost certainly been copied. He spent the better part of a year dealing with the fallout from that. These things ripple. The original violation is bad enough. But then there's the version of you that exists 6 months later. Checking the doorbell camera before you take a shower, going over your credit report every week, calling your neighbor to ask if anything looks unusual even though everything is probably fine. That version of you didn't exist before. Kevin Marsh and Diane Pryor and Corey Dillard created him. I've thought a lot about what I'd do differently, and the honest answer is, most of it comes down to assumptions I didn't know I was making. I assumed that hiring a property management service meant my property was secure. I assumed that because I'd signed a service agreement, the people with access to my home had some stake in protecting it. I assumed that if something was wrong, it would be obvious. None of those assumptions turned out to be true. So here's what I actually know now. On the other side of it, check your home rental platforms. I'm talking Vrbo, Airbnb, Furnished Finder, all of them. Type in your address. Do it right now if you travel for work. The idea that someone would be bold enough to list your home while you're gone sounds outrageous until you realize they're counting on you to find it exactly that outrageous, too unlikely to check for. Install cameras and monitor them actively, not just for break-ins, for patterns. Kevin's whole operation depended on the assumption that no one was watching. The moment there's a record of unauthorized entry with timestamps, the situation changes from a civil dispute to a criminal case. Evidence is the difference between justice and a shrug. Know your utility usage. My first red flag came from an HOA representative, not from me. I wasn't paying attention to my own bills closely enough to notice a 40% spike in electricity usage over 2 months. That should have been my alarm. If you're gone and consumption is climbing, something is wrong. Tell your neighbors what to expect. Walt had waved at me for 4 years but didn't have my phone number. He'd noticed things that might have helped me earlier, if he'd had any way to reach me. That's on me. Give someone nearby your number and tell them explicitly if you see anything at my house and I'm not due back, call me. Don't assume. Call. Be thoughtful about who has access. Smart locks exist for exactly this situation. Temporary codes you can create and revoke remotely. If you're going to hire a service with physical key access to your property, do background checks, check references yourself rather than relying on the company's word, and rotate the access codes or rekey regularly. The fact that Corey Dillard had been with Lone Star for 18 months without incident before this doesn't mean 18 months of good behavior is a guarantee. And finally, if something feels wrong, treat it like it is. Don't rationalize, don't wait. The detective who built my case told me he sees this kind of thing more than people would expect. Temporary rental fraud, especially targeting properties owned by people with predictable travel schedules, is not a rare crime. It just rarely gets documented well enough to prosecute. The only reason Kevin and Diane are sitting with criminal records right now is because I spent 11 days in a motel room with a prepaid tablet watching camera feeds instead of walking in the front door and blowing my own case. I still do the pipeline work, still rotate out for 2 and 3 weeks at a time. The job didn't change. The drive back to Odessa still looks the same. Flat, brown, the sky going orange over the flats as the sun drops. But when I pull into my driveway now, I sit in the truck for a minute before I go inside. Not because I'm scared. Because I earned this. I paid for it, literally and otherwise. And I'm not taking it for granted anymore. On the 1-year mark, I drove past the house Kevin had rented out longest. One of the other 6 properties, a brick place in a neighborhood south of mine. New family had moved in. Kids' bikes on the front porch. A basketball hoop at the end of the driveway. I hope whoever lives there checks their camera feeds and sleeps well and never has any reason to think about Kevin Marsh or Diane Pryor, or the particular kind of cold feeling that comes from realizing a stranger has been living your life while you were away working to pay for it. But I also hope they're careful, because people like that exist. They look at your absence and see a margin. They look at your schedule and see a listing. They look at your home. Your actual home, the place where you put down your boots and your coffee mug and your exhaustion at the end of a long rotation, and they see inventory. Don't let them. I've thought about what kind of person does what Kevin Marsh did. Not in an obsessive way, but in the way you inevitably do when something catches you off guard and you're trying to make sense of it. And what I keep coming back to is this. He wasn't some desperate man with nothing to lose. He had a LinkedIn profile. A website. He called himself a consultant. He built a system, recruited people into it, and ran it methodically for months. That's not chaos. That's a choice made over and over again. Every time he unlocked my door, every time he handed a key to Corey, every time Diane uploaded another photo of my living room to a rental platform. The choices we make when no one's watching, that's where character actually lives. Not in what we say we do, in what we do when we think the cost is 0. Kevin thought the cost was 0 because I wasn't there. Because I was 3 hours away on a pipeline, working the kind of job that keeps you gone long enough for someone to build a business out of your absence. What he didn't account for was that absence isn't the same as ignorance, and that a man who spends weeks at a time alone in the field has a certain patience about him. I didn't storm into that house. I sat in a motel room for 11 days and I documented everything. But it's not something I'm naturally good at. It's something I had to choose to be, one day at a time, because I understood that blowing my own case out of anger would mean Kevin walked away clean. There's something I want to say about Corey, the young man who worked for Lone Star and handed over my key and my schedule for a cut of the bookings. I don't know what he needed the money for. I don't know what Kevin said to him to make it seem like a reasonable thing to do. But Corey had been trusted with access to people's homes. That's a serious thing, and he knew it. He signed paperwork acknowledging it. And when someone offered him a financial shortcut, he decided the people whose homes he was trusted to protect were an acceptable price to pay. He cooperated fully once he was caught, and that matters. But cooperation after the fact doesn't erase the original decision. What I took from all of this isn't cynicism. I don't think most people are Kevin Marsh. I do think that systems without oversight attract the Coreys of the world. Not because all people are weak, but because no safeguard works forever without someone checking it. I should have been checking. I wasn't. I assumed that the agreement I signed meant the system was working. It didn't. That's on me as much as it's on him. The intelligence piece, and I mean this practically, not arrogantly, is about paying attention to your utility bill, to your neighbor's casual comment, to the small wrong details that you could explain away if you wanted to. I could have rationalized the electricity spike a dozen ways. Instead, I drove home. I didn't walk in blind. I observed first, then acted. That sequence matters more than people realize. Patience before confrontation isn't weakness. It's how you build a case instead of a scene. I still do the rotation. Still leave on Mondays and come back on Fridays. The pipeline doesn't care about what happened to me, and I don't expect it to. But I come home differently now. I check the feeds before I pull in the driveway. I know Walt's phone number by heart, and I know in a way I didn't before that the home I'm driving back to is worth protecting, not just with a lock, but with attention. That's what Kevin never counted on. That I pay attention.